Lovely. Well, I'm enjoying it, and it's a pleasure to welcome you. Have you had a chance to catch some of the events so far?
I've caught bits and pieces. It's been a little bit of a busy day with us with the so-called second wave of the pandemic, and a lot of our clients are having to once again rethink their executive secure transportation operations and are looking for options in terms of cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting, policies and procedures to limit exposure, things like that. So today's been a little bit more hectic than we anticipated.
No, I like it. Well, I mean, I don't like it's been hectic, but it's an important consideration. So beyond, I mean, I suppose back in the day, before Corona, people would probably come to you and say, "I want a B6, B7 type of armored vehicle." What's changed?
Well, in the past, we do a lot of work with our client base that is developed on the training side with consulting work, such as vehicle selection. And, obviously, we do a lot of work with armored vehicles, both training and specing, helping clients spec out and doing quality control and quality assurance checks. Now, the focus has been really since late January of last year, what measures can we put in place to manage and mitigate the risk of exposure to our executives when we do have to move them by ground? A lot of them initially, everybody was on lockdown, so there was some time to figure out some of these strategies and tactics to mitigate and manage these risks. But as time has gone on, and there's been a shift, if you will, with some of our clients, particularly in the finance industry, as was mentioned first thing this morning. There are some things that must be done in the office. So the idea that these executives weren't going into the office, weren't moving around, was very short-lived. So the question previously was, how do we manage this when we start moving them? Now it's how do we manage them and continue to move them, right? How do we manage these risks? And we looked very closely early on at cleaning, disinfecting, sanitizing vehicles, three complete different processes as we came to know, and when it would be appropriate to do it, what sort of policies, procedures, or protocols should be in place, who's allowed in the vehicle, how many passengers would you have in the vehicle? Would you say none? We're going to limit our C-level executives are going to be moved by just the driver. How many drivers are we going to allow to have access to them? Is it just going to be a specific driver assigned to them? And so we went through that entire process, and we built some guidelines for cleaning, disinfecting, and sanitizing vehicles that were very well received. Now there's been some advances technologically. There are certain types of UV systems that are actually used oftentimes in medical transport vehicles, but typically they say the vehicle shouldn't be occupied. Same thing with some of the fogger systems that fog disinfectants such as hydrogen peroxide. But the vehicles that those systems are typically used in are not the types of vehicles that executives are typically being transported in. So there's concerns with fit and finish of the interior, durability of some of those interior items. Ford came out with a very interesting approach in some of their vehicles. They actually have a software upgrade that can be downloaded from a dealer that will allow the heating system in the car to run up to 135 degrees and maintain that temperature for approximately 15 minutes. That will kill any microbes or microorganisms in the vehicle, which is very effective because now the ductwork gets treated. So it's a very effective process. However, again, the vehicle can't be occupied and it is of limited availability. So we've had to work through all of these. We have clients that are putting semi-permanent barriers, fitting them into the cars, a translucent or transparent shield, so that there's less air circulation between the back of the car and the front of the car. But there's not none. And then, of course, you still have to worry about sanitizing the ductwork and things like that. So it's been interesting, to say the least, to see this evolve. And now more and more clients are talking about the fact that with this second wave and the potential, there's been some media reports that it's much more contagious, much more transmittable, although it may be potentially less lethal. They're starting to look at now is, what about the exposure outside the car? Now, what if they bring something in the car, right? Sure, we can disinfect and sanitize after the executive left. We can fog it. We can UV light. You can even use an ozone generator, which is typically used by used car dealerships to take smells out of vehicles. They're very effective. But none of these, the vehicle can be occupied. So now they're looking for solutions. Hey, if the driver gets back in the car and may have been exposed inadvertently, or even the executive themselves, is there something we can do to minimize the potential risk of one or the other infecting one or the other? So now there's some small, I wouldn't call them fogging systems, but they're misters or spray systems. They're battery operated. And of course, the focus typically, no matter how much technology our clients are throwing at it, there's a level of comfort we're seeing that comes from having a process in place, a manual process, where disinfectants are used, where the vehicle is sanitized. Every time the executive gets out of the vehicle, the driver sanitizes, which is a quick wipe down of all the high touch surfaces. And then at the end of the day, that vehicle is disinfected, which is, a really good application of appropriate antibacterials and antimicrobials, really wetting the surface down and that sort of thing, in addition to the technology, sort of as we've seen a lot in the executive protection world over the years, a belt and suspenders approach. Yes, we have this technology, but we're going to back it up with a good old manual process. And then it comes down to, for a lot of our clients, because of the liability concerns, documentation. You've got to have a log, document when all of these activities were done, document what chemicals you're using, document what the potential risks of exposure is to those chemicals. So it's added a dimension to the secure transportation process or operation that didn't previously exist. And I'm of the mind, even as we get to the point where this pandemic starts to wane or has been defeated, I think it's going to be, as a common theme, as we've heard throughout the day, these processes are going to live beyond that. It's going to be part of the repertoire, if you will, of the security driver or the protection practitioner who happens to be behind the wheel, is this cleaning, sanitizing, disinfecting, logging all of these activities. I don't see it going back to not doing anything anytime soon.
No, that's a good point. Well, as you were saying that, and this is just unprepared, I just thought to myself, you know how billionaires might have, they might buy the latest armored Audi or armored BMW, and they would buy a new armored Audi in a BMW. Billionaires aside, multimillionaires classically have said, I only want to rent the latest armored BMW and armored Audi because I cannot afford to buy a new armored version each time. And I don't want to be seen in a not so up-to-date version, right? So with that line of thought, my question is, all of this preparation to sanitize it, is that not going to make the principle more visible?
Potentially. It depends on how, where the process is being conducted, and it depends, because a lot of our clients right now, their schedules are limited. So it's not, hey, let's go to the office, go out to lunch, let's stop over here, let's have a meeting at, XYZ Corporation's headquarters. A lot of it now is get them into the office where we know we have a process in place, cleaning, sanitizing, health checks, et cetera. They stay more or less in that office. They may be doing some video conferencing and whatnot, and then get them back to their house. So I think by and large, the visual signature, if you will, of the cleaning and sanitizing is minimal. Though we do have some clients who, by the nature of their business and their work, still have to be highly mobile, still interacting with other entities. So that is a concern. And, a lot of our clients are saying, well, if we're doing this, then what is the absolute minimum we should do it? What is the absolute maximum? And where should we be doing this? And of course, with anything that could increase a principal's profile, it's always where it is least visible, least noticeable. So is it in a parking garage as opposed to out on the street? Or if you're out on the street and you're in an area where there happen to be a lot of cars and drivers, relatively speaking, obviously, given the impact of COVID on ground transportation in general, is it something that others are doing so that you're not going to stand out? Can you do it discreetly? Can you keep the vehicle's doors closed while you're doing it instead of getting out, doing one quadrant of the car, moving to the next quadrant very visibly? Are there ways we can do it that are a little less profile? So you're absolutely right. That is a question and it is a concern that some of our clients also have to take into consideration in developing these processes. And then, of course, one is you have to, once you have this process, you have to adhere to it and you have to document it and you have to train folks on it. And that was, from our perspective and many of our clients, the godsend of those initial strict lockdowns was there was time to get things in place, processes, time to train people on those processes. And I think they're reaping a lot of that benefit now with the second wave, with the heightened concerns, because they can say to the executives, no, we've had, or the principal, if they're not a corporate executive, we have a process in place. We've implemented it since February or March. We're trained on it. We're documenting it's ongoing. So there's a little more comfort on the part of the principal or the executive that risk mitigation is taking place.
All right. So, we have in this audience a mixture of those who are purely EP and private, security, but we also have corporate security and people from corporate, accounts. Do you see a whole new customer base from conscious corporations who don't want to send their employees out in some sort of taxi? They're going to say, well, if you're going to have to go somewhere, you're going to have to go private, and it's going to have to be, nicely disinfected. Is that a whole new different type of customer?
Yes, in some regards. Keep in mind we have a very large footprint in the global corporate community, right? We have had for many years. So there's more downstream concerns in that regard, right? So the senior manager or junior executive who might not have been afforded transportation, well, now that is a serious concern. No, we don't want you on public transportation. We will provide a car or a service or a car and driver for you. A lot of our clients are going to their vendors for such services and saying, we need to see your COVID risk mitigation plans or processes. We need to see your documentation. We need to understand that you're doing what is appropriate and that you're actually doing those things. So that is, and we oftentimes get questions from our corporate clients and some of the family offices that we deal with saying, hey, what is it that we should be asking for? Or do you know a vendor who is already doing X, Y, and Z, of which we do. Some of our students come from those types of third-party service providers around the world. So there are some that are following the guidelines we developed, which many of our corporate clients are, as well as are doing things on their own, have those ozone generators, are using foggers, and on a regular basis and documenting. So they do want to know that. And the other, in the corporate world, the other thing you have to be concerned about is the Tax Act of 2017 made a small but significant change to Part 132.5, which deals with executive perks, right? Fringe benefits. That actually trickles down into the lower tiers of the executive management structure, which says, the Tax Act of 2017 says the employer can no longer reimburse an employee the expense for transportation from the residence to the workplace, unless it is for that employee's safety. So you have got to make that case. Otherwise, there is a potential. It's always potential, right? How aggressive would they be in enforcing it is always the question. But there's the potential now that those employees, you say, no, you're going to use a car service. We're going to reimburse you for that. Well, at some point, the IRS could say, well, no, that was transportation from the residence to the workplace. And you have nothing, no assessment, no documentation that says this is for X, Y, or Z. So I think the thinking security or even safety and security or even environmental health and safety manager in a corporation that is looking at these critical personnel and they're saying, hey, our best option from a COVID risk mitigation standpoint would be to use a private vendor who is doing the things that we feel are appropriate, is make sure that you document the reason why you're doing that. And it can be the rate of transmission in the general vicinity where they're traveling from. It can be the rate of hospitalization. It can be the potential that that employee may have a health condition, an underlying condition that would make them more vulnerable. All those things should be documented so that if the question arises, either the corporation isn't under the thumb for that tax burden, or the employee who received it, which is typically the case when you deal with Part 132.5 at the executive level. And interestingly, that Tax Act of 2017 took the option away from corporations if there was an inadvertent violation of 132.5, the secure ground transportation paragraph. They could go back to that executive and say, well, we'll reimburse you the tax liability. Well, in talking to two different tax attorneys, they said, if to the letter of that 2017 Tax Act, you can no longer do that because that's a reimbursement for an expense related to ground transportation. And that expense existed because under Part 132.5 for secure ground transportation, there wasn't an adequate assessment documented. So there's two sides to that. There is this trickle down effect as there's a potential that those essential employees that may not be at, let's say, that C-level executive level in the corporation are being provided transportation. It has to be documented and assessed that is specifically for their safety, in this case, health safety. And on the other side of the coin is the longstanding requirement for a security assessment if you're claiming it at the executive level that there's a business related security risk, and that's why we're providing that transportation.
Well, I'm really pleased you share that, because that's something real and actionable. I think all the audience is going to go away and go, all right, I must check that off. You know, we like to have outputs from this type of conference as well. You know, people need to take action.
Well, and if they're interested in more of that, because it's not the most interesting subject, but it is a critical subject. We actually put together earlier this year a video presentation that is on the International Security Driver Association, ISDA, on their resource center at isdacenter.org, and it's publicly accessible. It's also out on several social media channels that really digs down into both quantifying the return on investment of a security driver, which is also important in this times as corporations are cutting budgets. How do you justify having those drivers to begin with? And then, of course, the return on that investment being the reduction in that tax liability. So if they go to isdacenter.org, they can look it up, and it talks about the business case and return on investment of a security driver.
Nice. I just posted it there. So I guess maybe a final thought, a final question that I think would benefit our audience. COVID, Corona, yes, big elephant in the room. But what was Protected Mobility working on before all of this that we might pick up again on the other side of all of this?
Well, it's very simple, at least from our perspective. What we've been working very closely with our clients, and in fact has impacted in a positive way our training, which is the proliferation of technology. You know, corporations are dealing with all sorts of technological advances. I've heard a couple of folks speaking about them in their area of expertise. When it comes to protective transportation or secure transportation, the ongoing march towards autonomous vehicles, so-called self-driving cars, which is much slower a march than a lot of the proponents have been saying. In fact, even some of the staunchest proponents are saying we're at a minimum a decade away from a true self-driving vehicle, and potentially another decade before it becomes a production vehicle. But we're looking very closely at that, because with the technological advances that exist on cars today that are part of that evolution towards that self-driving car, there are some disadvantages that the driver is placed at. Collision avoidance with pedestrian detection systems, for example. Well, you inadvertently come down a street and there is a peaceful protest blocking the street. If you do not act quick enough, okay, what will happen is it's entirely possible, if the crowd starts to surround the car, you will not be able to move that car forward because the sensors won't let you, the system won't let you, right? So we look at those things. And then of course, the flip side to the technology is you don't want drivers to become over dependent or too complacent, because again, using collision avoidance with pedestrian detection technology as an example, earlier this year in January, AAA released a study, Consumer Reports released a study that showed that those systems at above 20 miles an hour only are effective 40% of the time against an adult-sized target, a mannequin. And in the hours of darkness, they're virtually ineffective. The systems simply don't work. So the technology, there's two sides of it. Is there are these disadvantages that you have to consider in things like route planning and even training drivers to react, even vehicle selection. What technology does it have? And how does that technology affect that vehicle's operations? Okay. Then you have the other side of it, which is you don't want the drivers becoming over reliant on it because the technology isn't perfected yet. And it does not always work as it's advertised or perceived that it will work. So those are some challenges we're facing. And, there's interest. There's a gentleman over in the UK. He's been doing a lot of research on basically on the autonomous vehicles, the so-called self-driving cars. But recognizing that a lot of that technology is already being used, such as LiDAR, which is a way for the vehicle to sense what's around it. And then the ultra high def camera systems that read information literally from the road surface and the signs. And you start to look at where some of the limitations of that are, as this gentleman's done. And there's some videos out there on social media that depict his work. So for example, the rules of the road say, if you're on a roadway and there is a dashed line and a solid line separating the lanes, if you're on the dashed line side, then it's legal for you to cross that line. If you're on the solid line side, it is not legal to do that. Well, these systems are, as they're developing them towards autonomous driving, these systems are designed to recognize that. So he takes a car in its self-driving mode into a parking lot that he has painted a dashed circle, and inside of that, a solid circle. And the car goes in there. And again, it's not fully autonomous, right? But it has an autonomous mode. So the car goes into the circle. It will cross into the circle, into the solid line, right? It'll cross that solid line because the dashed line's on the outside. Once it gets inside the solid line, it looks a bit like an Austin Powers movie where the car is trying to jockey its way out and can't find its way out. So again, even though that's looking over the horizon at autonomous vehicles, that technology is being incorporated today, and that vulnerability exists.
I love it. You've painted a really vivid and crazy picture of where things could end up.
Yes. And then when you start talking about, as you get closer and closer to autonomous vehicles, and you're talking about meshed networks where cars are interconnected, it creates a vulnerability that if I can identify that node, right, in that network and who it is, it's possible to track it or potentially to hack that car through an interconnected system, through that mesh network, and wreak all sorts of havoc. So you've got these programming issues, then you've got the potential for this technology to be used offensively against the occupant of the vehicle. And even if you back it up a step, that same gentleman who did the experiment with the painted lines on the parking lot took a high def camera assembly and a LiDAR assembly from a vehicle, hook them to the, in a lab to a main controller, an ECU, electronic control unit for the engine, which is connected to the system. With the LiDAR array, he shines a laser pen that he bought on Amazon for $29.95 at that laser array. It doesn't understand what the signal is. It doesn't match with any outgoing transmission it's made. So it trips the computer into safe mode, meaning that car would come to a stop. And with the high def cameras, he uses a commonly available high def multi lens light and a standard flasher unit. And the light is so bright because it's a high intensity LED, it causes whiteout in the cameras, right? So the cameras can't see the image, and again, trips the vehicle into safe mode. Half of the cameras that he tried that with, it burnt the image into the CCD chip and the camera was no longer usable. And those cameras, again, are being used in today's collision avoidance technology and could potentially be spoofed, if you will, by these devices into putting that car into limp or safe mode, creating a risk to the executive.
You can almost imagine it, can't you? You could use one of those million lumen torches, but you could also just stand in the road. The avoidance collision thing says, I'm not moving anywhere. You take out an armor-piercing round at close range.
Yes. Yeah. So now I don't need multiple people or multiple vehicles. If I get you at a crowded intersection and I can stand in front of you in the crosswalk or step off the curb and stand in front of you, and you've happened to curbside park and somebody pulled up close behind you, and now you have an issue. And keep in mind, this technology is evolving. So right now, the majority of collision avoidance technology is forward-looking. Well, about 5% of the cars sold in the US last year, and they're projecting in 2022, 15% of the cars sold globally will have rear collision avoidance, which would do the same thing. Now, all of a sudden, the vehicle can't move at all. It takes a very nominal amount of resources if you can identify the vehicle and approach it in a circumstance or environment that works against it, where one person could alleviate the advantage that a car has typically always had, which is what? Mobility and maneuverability. Right? And even an armored vehicles are bullet resistant, enough time, enough shots fired, and that armor can be pierced. And we see that earlier this year with Omar Garcia Harfuch, the chief of police in Mexico City, was ambushed while in an armored vehicle. Rounds did pierce the vehicles. It was sustained heavy rate of fire at very close distance, mortally wounding his bodyguard and his driver. He survived, and we're working with Tony Scotti, our benefactor, in finalizing a study of that. And in that instance, some of the technology in the vehicle may have contributed, not necessarily the root cause, but may have contributed to the attacker's success. Because we replicated the environment here, and from some information that we had access to, we were able to, what we believe is closely replicate that scenario. And we did it in a vehicle that was very similar. It has ABS brakes, has an electronically controlled transmission. And depending on the braking technique you use, depending on how you shift the transmission, you can add tremendous amount of risk. For example, using threshold braking as opposed to allowing the anti-lock brakes to do their job. Using a driver who was highly trained, had trained people in different braking techniques, has worked overseas in these armored platforms, allowing the ABS brakes to do their job and stop the vehicle. He stopped in 102 feet at the speed that we believe Harfuch's vehicle was moving. Using a technique, a legacy technique called threshold braking, his first attempt, right, with no prior practice, 172 feet. What we know from imagery from the scene is that would have potentially had the principal's vehicle colliding with the blocking vehicle, the vehicle that was blocking its lane. Right? Then once the vehicle was at a stop, how long does it take to maneuver it in reverse? Well, over the years, you tend to develop some the technical term is heuristics, shortcuts. One of the common shortcuts we see is, hey, as a vehicle's coming to a stop, right, rotate your foot off that brake and onto the gas to eliminate transmission lag. Well, with an electronically controlled transmission, under the right circumstances, you actually create transmission lag doing that, because the sensors for the transmission controller go back through their process of assessing each of the sensors before they'll let the transmission shift in reverse. And in our testing, 1.2 to 1.5 seconds of increased time before the transmission is in reverse and the vehicle actually starts moving. And that's a lifetime if you're 20 to 25 feet away from 7 men armed with long guns who are, targeting you at a very high rate of fire.
Well, if that hasn't woken people up next to a fire, I don't know what will. No, this is excellent.